during his message. Where did it come from? Do y'all remember?
It comes originally from God's charge to Israel.
Yeah. He's using language that was clearly given to Israel to describe the church. The very same exact language, in fact, to describe the church. Now, if I could back up for just a moment and say this. This language was said to Israel not because they were Israel, but because they were the nation that God chose out of all the other nations to give this calling that Randy has been telling us about, that this was another form of Adam, a corporate Adam. There's nothing special about Israel except that God chose them.
And he tells them essentially that.
Yeah.
That you were greater in number or somehow better than
Yeah.
the other nations.
So when he then, as Randy showed this morning, when he then begins to, if you could say, pass the torch on, when he says, Israel, you have failed, and he then is choosing out this other people, which, by the way, he had chosen from all eternity. When he's drawing out this other people and giving them their calling, how is he going to refer to them? In the same way he referred to Israel, because he's giving them the same commands, the same calling. He calls them a kingdom and priests unto God because that's exactly what they are. And it just happens to be the church, the people of God. Now I'm going to show you through this that it's the church, the people of God, but all of it is couched in this understanding of them being the genuine, the true Israel. In the terms of what Israel was originally called for, the church can be said to be the genuine, true Israel. Now, we see the same thing in 1 Peter, and y'all ought to be very familiar with these passages by now. But 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 and 5. And as you come to him, a living stone, and we saw that this morning portrayed in all those things that Randy was saying about Christ being the cornerstone or the stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. He says very clearly what the church is to be. We are to be those living stones being built up into that holy temple. So we know this temple that Peter's talking about is not some physical temple. It's being constructed with living stones, the people of God. So it's not some physical stone and wood building. It is a building. It is a true temple. Because you remember, what did we say? What is the temple? Dwelling place of God, yeah. That's what the temple is, regardless of what form it takes. It's the dwelling place of God. It's just as much a temple when it is the people of God in which He dwells as it is a stone building in which His presence is, where the priests go in once a year. It doesn't, in fact, it's actually more real when it's the people of God.
And don't you see that in the appearances of God to the patriarchs, and they built these little shrines, these little temples? It was commemorating that this is a place where God presenced Himself with them. It was not the emphasis on the shrine or the
No.
temple. It was the emphasis on the presence of God.
This is where God met with man. And so that becomes the temple, the place where God is or was. The difference is now when it comes to the people of God, He is eternally with His people because His Spirit is indwelling them. And regardless of where they are or where they might be, nothing separates them from God. Not even death itself can separate them from God, neither height nor depth nor any other created thing. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. He dwells in us. We are the temple. We are the place of His presence. And people, that is fulfillment of all of those promisorial images before. We are the people of God. Then he goes on to say, verses 9 and 10, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession." People, that's straight out of the Old Testament. "That you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." And that's exactly what we've been talking about, the idea of expanding the temple. Proclaim the excellencies of him. Taking the reality of God to the nations. That's our calling. That's indeed our worship. That is our sacrifice. As we sacrifice ourselves to bring the glory of God to the nations, to the people. "Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." Straight out of the book of Hosea. And again, we're going to see how all that ties in to this understanding of the church as the true Israel, the people of God. I want you to notice the passage that this comes from, Exodus 19. "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. And for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." Is that not pretty clear in that passage? If you compare those two passages and look how Peter is using that terminology, he is clearly portraying the church as being in the same role that the nation of Israel was back there in Exodus. In fact, he's even portraying it in an even greater way. But for those that might still not really understand how this can be so, for the ones that would say, well, what about God's promises that he made to the nation of Israel? Is he just going to go back on his promises? Is he untrustworthy? Is he going to refuse to follow through with those promises that he made? I mean, if he's not going to fulfill the promises he made to Israel back there, what confidence could we possibly have that he's going to fulfill the promises that he made to us? I mean, let's just be blunt and honest. I mean, I think we have to be realist. If God is not going to fulfill those promises back then, how in the world are we to have any hope that he is going to fulfill the promises that he's made to us? Okay, that's what we're fixing to show, Brother Ron. That's what we're fixing to show. Those, basically any promise he made. Any promise he made to the people of Israel. You know?
Does it have to do with what you said several months ago that the covenants in the Old Testament were conditional and that they had failed in their commitment to those covenants, whereas the new covenant with the church is unconditional?
And that has a lot to do with some of those promises. It does. But you know the amazing thing, Carl? Many times, even when God made promises that were conditional on their obedience, even after they disobeyed, he still fulfilled his promises. For his name's sake.
There's a certain sense in which a lot of those promises to Israel were unconditional as well.
Yeah. And so how then do we reconcile these things? Well, Paul takes that up in the book of Romans and deals with it very straightforwardly, very matter-of-factly. In fact, he even assumes the questions that people are going to ask. You know, is God unfaithful? Is God going to fail to fulfill what he promised? I want us to follow the argument of Paul, and we're not going to spend a great deal of time on this, but I want us to follow the argument of Paul because it has direct bearing on this whole issue of the church being Israel, being the true Israel. I want you to notice first what he says in Romans chapter 9, verses 6 through 8. He said, "It is not as though the word of God has failed." The promises is talking about. It's not that the word of God has failed, For not all who are descended from Israel belong